Do you consider yourself a scientist, or do you consider yourself an artist? Does it even matter? Maybe you're both, or maybe you're neither, but as much as we tend to separate the two into distinct, mutually exclusive categories, it's undeniable that science and the arts have an influence on each other. Today, I'm going to talk about the stories in science. So what do I mean by the stories in science? Well, I mean the stories that have been crafted using science as a medium. The ones that have been inspired by science, that have taken science to extremes, the ones that ask questions about how science can influence the world that we live in. Essentially, I mean to discuss the place where imagination and knowledge intersect. So before I begin, I think it would be a good idea to discuss the differences between science and the arts. Let's take a well-known example of a tree in a forest. If a tree falls in a forest during a storm and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, scientifically, yes, it does, because the air particles around the tree are still disrupted and the vibrations still occur. So yes, it does make a sound. But a philosopher may argue differently. They may ask, well, what is a sound? Is it necessarily the same as a sound wave? If a sound is something that must be heard by a living thing, then no, it doesn't make a sound. Both are different, but both are correct. Science has fascinated artists for hundreds of years. There's an entire genre of fiction dedicated to it, science fiction. In science fiction, writers use the possibilities of scientific discoveries to create characters and societies that we can only imagine. In H.G. Wells' book, The Invisible Man, Griffin isn't invisible because of magic. He's invisible because of science. So, on the board are 6 different images which represent 6 different things. We have a picture of Mary Shelley, the influence of politics in the year 1948, a poem, To My Brothers, by John Keats, a diagram of a kidney, which represents organ transplants, a picture of, or a representation of artificial intelligence, and a stethoscope, which represents the field and study of medicine. So if I were to sort these 6 different things on a scale from most scientific to most creative, what would go where? Let's start with Mary Shelley. Shelley was a writer during the Victorian period, so probably more creative. Politics in post-war Europe, and for that matter, the entire world, was a source of inspiration and outrage for many 20th century writers, so I've also placed this on the side of the arts. Next, the poem To My Brothers was written by John Keats, a leading figure of the Romantic era, definitely more creative. Organ transplants would almost certainly fall on the scientific, and as would artificial intelligence, and medicine likewise. So there we have it, a clear separation between science and the arts. But let's take a look at these in a bit more detail. So Mary Shelley. Well, Shelley is best known for her 1818 novel, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. In the novel, Dr. Frankenstein is an intelligent and ambitious scientist who becomes obsessed with the nature of life, absolutely convinced that he can use science to, essentially, create artificial life. To put his findings to the test, he begins constructing a body by stealing body parts from graves, and then he harnesses the power of electricity to breathe life into this being. And he succeeds. But his ambition and his thirst for knowledge backfire when society, and even he himself, look upon his creation as a monster which he has now unleashed into the world. There's something inherently eerie about this story of Frankenstein, so much so that elements of this Gothic tale, the storm and the stitched-up body parts and the figure of the mad scientist, have become staples in the horror story genre. Meanwhile, some 2 centuries later, in the scientific world, organ transplants have become a well-known and effective form of medical treatment. This is when an organ from one person is donated and placed into the body of another. It's often a life-saving procedure. Like Shelley's Frankenstein, this use of organs promotes life. But unlike Frankenstein, this procedure is actually ethical and doesn't result in an 8-foot-tall corpse wandering around European countryside, hopefully at least. Of course, it's still important to recognize that Frankenstein's monster is not a reality, and organ transplants are a clear step of progress in healthcare. But it is an example of science in literature, and how stories like this one can delve deeply into the ethics of science. So let's look at another example. In the year 1948, influenced by the state of the world just after the Second World War, George Orwell wrote his darkly satirical novel, 1984. In this novel, there is a department of government called the Fiction Department, where novel-writing machines churn out books for the consumption of the masses. And again, if we compare this piece of literature to the modern world, no, we don't live in fear of Big Brother. But the other day, I asked an AI software to write me a story about a machine that writes stories. And this is the start of what it came up with. Okay, so it needs a bit of work, and a lot of people could probably write a lot better, but it's still a story. And more importantly, it's another example of science in literature. Again, like Frankenstein, it's taken to extremes, but again, it has a clear connection. So moving on to our last example, the poem To My Brothers is written by Keats for his brother Tom, who was dying of tuberculosis. In this poem, Keats describes the physical effects of the disease on Tom, his dearly loved but rapidly deteriorating brother. And again, we see this intermingling of science and the arts. Keats himself was a doctor and thus was able to perceive these effects, which subtly present themselves in the writing. The small, busy flames and fresh-laid coals mean that they were keeping the room warm for Tom, indicating he was suffering from a fever, a common symptom of TB. The faint cracklings and whispers parallel that of a TB patient's breathing, and Tom's eyes are fixed, as in poetic sleep. This could be describing exhaustion or even a comatose state. Keats also expresses his hopes that the evening will pass smoothly, quietly, or otherwise without the violent coughing fits characteristic of TB. On a slightly happier note, like organ transplants and the rise in AI, science has developed significantly since Keats' time, and modern medicine can now cure tuberculosis using triple antibiotic therapy. So let's reassess the spectrum now. True, Shelley is still on the artistic side, and organ transplants are still scientific, but perhaps they're closer than we thought. George Orwell's work is still a work of fiction, but there are striking similarities between his predictions of the capabilities of machinery that he made over 75 years ago and the rise in and current reality of AI that we now find ourselves in. And finally, familial love mingles with the effects of disease in Keats' poem, bringing the tragedy of life and death and the role and progress of medicine together. All of these examples are stories founded upon science. They are stories that feature science and stories that question science. They explore the good and the bad of science, its past and its future. And while the creative and the scientific are certainly different, to completely compartmentalize them would be, I think, to stifle them both, because without the influence of science and literature, stories like these ones, the stories in science, would not exist. Thank you.